So let's open with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for the privilege to come before you, to pray, to approach your throne right now as we talk about the importance of prophecy through Daniel chapter 11. And as Mark's going to be going over part 4 of the session, we pray that everything that he'll be covering today will bring glory to your name. We pray that you will be lifted up, Lord, so that you will draw all men, all women to you. And guide us as we see that the elements, the section that Mark will be covering tonight will be important for where we are living in the world's history right now. So we thank you again for your loving kindness and mercy. In Jesus' name, amen. Mark, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Craig. You can hear me okay? I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me, which one? Okay, so it's good to be here again. I'm going to be moving very quickly this evening, and one thing you'll benefit from is the fact that you've got the notes. I want to make sure I get to and get through verses 40 to 45. And so you'll have detailed notes. So bear with me as I go over a little bit of yesterday's presentation that I didn't get a chance to kind of do justice to. And bear with me as I quickly move from verses 32 to 39. And there's a lot of information I'm going to share. And all of the information you'll get in the handouts, or that you got a PowerPoint and a Word document. Pretty much the same. What you have is just two different formats for the most part. So yesterday we got to verse 30 for the most part, and we saw a reference to the ships of Chittim coming against him. The him in that particular context is a reference to the King of the North. King of the North at this time is Rome. The ships of Chittim is a reference to a naval fleet that was commanded by a Vandal king whose name was Genseric. Some would pronounce it Geiseric. The Vandals came down from the north into the Western Roman Empire in the 6th century. They were pushed over towards Spain by the Visigoths, and eventually they went down into southern Spain, and eventually they were in North Africa. So they became people south of the King of the North, and that is Rome. Eventually they come up from the south and attack the Romans using Chittim or Cyprus as a naval base, and they basically strike a decisive blow to the Romans. Genseric is part of the 7 trumpets that we begin to read about in Revelation chapter 8. There are 7 trumpets. The four of the trumpets, the first 4 trumpets, they bring down Western Rome. Trumpets 5 and 6, they have a lot to do with the bringing down of Eastern Rome, and the 7 trumpets as a combination or as a sequence, they parallel the seals and the churches. But I'm not going to go into any detail there because that's another study. So verse 30, the ships of Chittim or Genseric attacks Rome from the south, and Rome is defeated in that battle, and there's a return referred to. So Rome returns from defeat, and there's this connection made between Rome pagan and those who have indignation against the Holy Covenant. And the red there, he shall even return, is a reference to pagan Rome, and have intelligence with them that forsake the Holy Covenant. So what we see in verse 30 is the beginning of a transition from paganism to papalism. And those who are forsaken or have indignation against the Holy Covenant, this is a reference to the church in Rome having fallen away in fulfillment of certain prophecies. And you can see in the quotes that you'll read, and when you go through the presentation that I've sent to Craig, and Craig has kind of sent to you information that will help you to better understand the content of verse 30. And what you'll see in this slide is just how the 7 churches and the dates that are connected to the 7 churches of Revelation chapters 2 and 3, how they correspond with verses in Daniel chapter 11. You got the same here with the seals. So you've got the 7 seals, their dates, and they're pretty much parallel the 7 churches, and how the different seals correspond with the different verses of Daniel 11. And there you have the 7 trumpets, which aligned to a certain degree with the seals and the churches, and how those trumpets connect to different verses in Daniel 11. Just notes relational to what we've looked at so far. In verse 30, we're introduced to another power, in the sense that you've got to switch from pagan to papal Rome beginning. Them that forsake the Holy Covenant describes the Roman Catholic system of worship. Forsaking the Holy Covenant is a falling away culminating with Roman Catholicism. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 describes the falling away and the emergence of the man of sin. And we're going to look at the man of sin as we go from verses 32 to 39 and even beyond. When you look at the seven churches, the letter of the church in Pergamos is found in Revelation chapter 2, as well as the events connected with the opening of the third seal of Revelation chapter 6, correspond with verses 29 to 31. That transitional point from paganism to papalism. And the first four trumpets of the seven trumpets bring down pagan Rome, also Western pagan Rome, resulted in the emergence of the 10 horns or 10 kingdoms that are referred to in Daniel chapter 7. And there was a gradual erosion of paganism beginning in the 4th century when Constantine relocates from Rome to Constantinople, converts to Christianity. And what you see from the 4th century going into the beginning of the 6th century is the gradual erosion of paganism, and it's replaced by papalism. This graphic here is very useful, I think, because in chapter 2, first column, you can identify that the first kingdom of Bible prophecy is Babylon, because the head of gold is described as such. You've got silver, brass, iron, and iron and clay. In chapter 7, you've got the same sequence. I've put question marks by the line, but we know from chapter 2 that the first kingdom is Babylon. But we're not sure who the bear is, the leopard, the terrible beast, or the little horn. When we get to chapter 8, we know that Babylon is excluded. So we're starting with the second kingdom, the kingdom that follows after Babylon. And we know from chapter 5 that the kingdom that follows after Babylon are the Medes and the Persians. The ram represents the Medes and the Persians, hence the bear and the silver, they're Medo-Persia. We know that after the ram, you've got a he-goat that represents Greece. So we now know that the leopard and the brass represent Grecia. We don't know who the little horn, phase 1 is of chapter 8, nor the terrible beast or the iron. And we identify who the fourth beast is using the verse that we looked at yesterday. That's verse 20 of Daniel 11. We know that the raiser of taxes is the Roman emperor. So we can identify that the fourth beast in Bible prophecy, when we're looking at Daniel 2, 7, and 8, is pagan Rome. And what we'll look at today is how to identify phase 2 of the little horn of Daniel 8, the little horn of Daniel 7, and the iron and clay of Daniel 2. And we'll see that verses 30 to 31 give us a little insight into what happens in Rome, corruption and the union of church and state. In verse 31, it talks about arms standing on his part. Now remember, Rome now has transitioned from pagan to papal. So that his part, or that he's in this context, is pagan Rome. The arms represent state powers. What happens in the 6th century is pagan tribes come into Western Rome, and 7 of the pagan tribes are converted to Catholicism. And they basically, to a certain degree, back the papacy, especially Clovis, the Frankish king. And what happens is 3 powers that came into Western Rome are subjugated and eradicated ultimately. The Heruli in about 492, 493, depending on who you read. The Vandals in 533, and the Ostrogoths are evicted from Rome in 538. What also happens that's significant, though, and there's some debate over what the daily sacrifice represents in this verse. I lean towards the interpretation of it being paganism, because what happens at the same time as certain powers give their authority to the papacy and their backative to the papacy, you see the final demise of paganism, and that was continually in the way of Catholicism. Because remember, because of paganism, until 313, Christianity was illegal in Rome, and so until paganism was taken out of the way, papalism couldn't emerge, and so it required the removal of paganism for papalism to gain a significant foothold. And when it talks about placing the abomination that make it desolate, that's papal Rome. That's papal Rome. And you can see different references to what I've just said in this particular in Josiah Litch's writing, and Ellen White mentions a transition in the well, you can read In the 6th century, the papacy had become fairly established, and the removal of paganism and so on and so forth. And so the taking away of the daily, and you can see on the screen here, is the removal of paganism, because paganism was in the way of papalism. Until paganism was removed, papalism couldn't thrive, because paganism and papalism were at loggerheads to a certain degree. Although paganism, or rather papalism, is baptized paganism, with that, well, with the existence of paganism, or while paganism existed, Catholicism or papalism couldn't control things in Rome. And so verse 31, you can see in the red there, and arms or military powers, the 10 horns, trumpets, and stuff, all kinds of things happen that helped out the papacy. And those are the people who forsake the Holy Covenant. So different political powers gave strength to the papacy, resulted in the taking away or the decimation of certain tribes who resisted, also paganism, and the military powers, even Eastern Rome, they conspired to put in place the abomination that makes desolate, and that's Catholicism in 538. I've gone through that kind of quickly. If you read the notes, it will make more sense. Another view is that state power stands on the part of the papacy, church and state unite, and the polluting of the sanctuary of strength is an attack on God's temple and God's truth and Christ's heavenly ministration. And I don't have too much of an issue with that, because it still helps us to understand what went on in the 5th going into the 6th century, where the papacy was concerned. And it's kind of a mixture of the two, because paganism is removed, church and state unite, forming Catholicism or Roman Catholicism in the fullest sense. And then Roman Catholicism does trample the truth. It does attack Christ's heavenly ministration and so on and so forth. So you can kind of have an amalgamation of the two. Now I'm going to come out of that slideshow very quickly, close it. I'm going to then go into part 4. I'm going to move very, very quickly, because I want to get to, bear with me. What's going on? I'm going to move very, very quickly. What that is. So, you've got the notes, so you can revisit what I'm going through. And let me go into it right away. So, understanding Daniel chapter 11, part 4. This is verses 32 to 45. A lot of information. You've got a graphic there that will help you to understand what was going on from the collapse of Western Rome in 476 to the establishment of church and state in 538. You've got the three horns plucked between 493 when the Heruli were plucked, and 538 when the Ostrogoths were evicted from Rome by Belisarius, a Roman general who was sent by Justinian. Then you've got the 1260 year period. And so hopefully that graphic will help you when it comes to understanding that period of history as it relates to prophecy. So what does Ellen White say about the 11th chapter of Daniel? If you read the quote here, Ellen White doesn't say a lot about Daniel 11. Not a lot of people have looked into Daniel 11. And as I've said before, Daniel 11 is a rich field of study, in the sense that there's a lot of treasure in there that hasn't been discovered, I believe, because not a lot of people have dug that part of the field. Imagine the book of Daniel as a field. I looked at it yesterday. Chapters 2 and 7 have been dug a whole lot, especially 2. A lot of people start their sequence of Bible studies with others by looking at Daniel 2 to prove that the Bible can be trusted because of the accuracy of the prophecy in chapter 2. So chapter 2 has been dug thoroughly. Chapter 7, as well as chapter 2, has been dug thoroughly. Chapter 8, a lot, but not as much as chapters 2 and 7, because there are certain portions of 8 that people may struggle with. And chapter 8 also has to be coupled together with chapter 9. Chapter 11, I don't think has been dug anywhere near as thoroughly as 2, 7, 8 plus 9. So when we're studying 11, we're looking to find, we may even find things that no one's ever seen before. So in your own time, look at the chapter thinking, what can I find that maybe no one has seen? And it's not about finding it so you can say, look at what I found. You're looking to find it so you can reveal it to people and say, look at this thing about Jesus that I found, this thing about history that I found from chapter 11. So let's look at verse 32. Such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt, Now remember, the king of the north in the context now is the papacy. The papacy. So the he here is the papacy. So the papacy is going to corrupt a certain group of people by flatteries. But then it says, but the people who do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So you've got two sets of people, and the papacy in the middle. So you've got the papacy in the context here is he that shall corrupt by flatteries. So that's the papacy. So you've got one group of people, such as do wickedly against the covenant, or those who reject the covenant, who don't live by the truth. They're going to be corrupted by flatteries. So the papacy will get these people. The papacy will get these people. Catholicism will get these people. And we're going to explore very briefly Proverbs Chapter 7, which talks about a young man devoid of understanding who hasn't hidden the law in his heart. The people who do know their God, those who have hidden the word in their hearts, they're going to be strong and do exploits. Yeah. So we look at different versions, and I recommend looking at different versions when going through the verses of chapter 11, because some of the modern versions they're easier to understand in the King James, I find anyway. So utilize different versions. Don't just go for one other version. Look for how the verses may read in multiple versions. I like the ERV. It says the northern king or the papacy will use lies and smooth talking to trick those who quit following the holy agreement. So if you're not hiding the word in your heart, you're going to fall for the lies and smooth talking of the papacy. And they'll sin even worse. But those who know God and obey him will be strong, and they will fight back. So you've got two groups of people. Those who don't hide the word in their hearts, they're going to succumb to the lies and the flattery. Those who do hide the word in their hearts, they're going to do things for God. And again, you've got Litchi who will kind of break that down and give a little more insight into what I was just sharing. And Uriah Smith, the same. So in your own time, read for those quotes. A list of things to do with the papacy as it relates to corrupting by flatteries. If you look at Revelation chapter 12, verses 13 and 14, you'll see references, as well as chapter 17 and verse 5 to a dragon, a serpent, and a harlot. So Satan, he ultimately is the dragon, but the dragon can also be synonymous with Rome. So dragon, serpent, and harlot, they're entities through which Satan works. Yep, so we've got identities there of entities through which Satan works. Genesis 3, verses 1 to 6, we're looking at how Satan uses, or what Satan does using mediums or media, hosts, if you will, and what he's going to do in relation to corrupting by flatteries. So if you want to understand what the papacy is going to do, because remember, in Genesis 3, the enemy of souls, Satan, uses a literal beast to attack a literal woman. In Revelation 12, we see that Satan uses a symbolic beast to attack a symbolic woman or the church. So when we look at Genesis 3, we can gain great insight into what Satan is going to do and how he comes with his flatteries. Proverbs 7 is very important. When you look at Proverbs 7, you'll see a harlot woman depicted, and she's trying to tempt a man devoid of understanding, a young man who hasn't hidden the word in his heart. I remember Revelation 17 and verse 5 describes the papacy as a harlot, a mother of harlots. So if you want to understand a little bit more about what the papacy will do, or what Satan will do through the papacy, you've got Genesis 3, you've got Proverbs chapter 7. The whole of the chapter will give you insight into what this harlot woman does to this young man. It's a spiritual thing. Yeah, it's a lesson about how you should beware of certain kinds of women, but ultimately it's a warning against false religion. Remember, a harlot can represent a false church, typifies a false church. Daniel 7 verses 25 or verse 25, what the dragon says, or the entity through which Satan works. Look at Great Controversy, page 446, you'll see more insight into that. You've got Revelation 2 verses 18 through to 29, the letter of the church of Thyatira, which gives you insight into Jezebel, the church of Thyatira. Jesus says, I've got aught against you, I've got something against you. You allow Jezebel to teach. That basically plugs us into 1 Kings from around chapter 16 going to 17 and 18, where Ahab and Jezebel join forces. So you can learn a little bit about the flatteries of the papacy, or Satan through the papacy. When you look at the experience of Ahab and Jezebel, it's a mighty, mighty story in the sense that Jezebel, who typifies a fallen church, unites with Ahab, who typifies state. And so the coming together of Ahab and Jezebel give us a little insight into what the papacy will do. And they come together and they promote sun worship. Yeah. in Israel, sun worship is basically it becomes the thing, and then God brings Elijah, and there's a 3.5 years period or a 1260 days period where there's a famine and so on and so forth. Elijah is in the wilderness and he's fed by ravens and so on and so forth, which typifies what God will do, or what God would eventually do for the church. Because when you look at the experience of the church, when the church goes into the wilderness in Revelation chapter 12, God nourishes the church while in the wilderness, just as he nourished Elijah. And then toward the end of the 1260 in Elijah's time, there's a reformation in the sense that he comes and says, how long halt ye between two opinions? Toward the end of the 1260, in the Christian dispensation, you've got this reformation when people begin to say, how long are you going to halt between two opinions? It's either Catholicism or Protestantism. And when you look at the Word document, you'll see some notes that are connected to each of the eight things on the list. Matthew 4 verses 1 to 11 relates to worship and so on and so forth. When Jesus is tempted, if you be the Son of God. And again, it's a little insight into the flatteries that Satan comes with. Revelation 17 verses 4 and 5, the harlot woman. Exodus 20. You've got lots of things to consider. And as I said, when you go through the notes in your own time, this is the PowerPoint document. But when you look at the Word document, there are some notes that you can kind of connect to each of the 8 bullet points there that will explain them a little bit more. Looking upon the line upon line, whenever you see in the book of Revelation and elsewhere in Scripture a reference to a previous story, Revelation 2 and verse 20 points to Jezebel. And so in order to better understand the papal period, go to the story of Jezebel. James chapter 5 points us back to the same period, and it highlights the 1260 at the time of Jezebel. So there are different ways that you can plug in certain stories to better understand the prophetic narrative. In Revelation chapter 11, you can see a reference to Elijah and the shutting up of the waters and the rain and so on and so forth. So prophecy often leans upon different Bible narratives, and we can use characters in different Bible narratives to typify certain players in the great controversy as it relates to Christianity and the Christian dispensation, or making sense. Now it refers to people who know their God and do exploits. So you've got people who are flattered into accepting Catholicism because they haven't hidden the word in their hearts. You've got people who know their God and do exploits. And again, if you touch on Revelation chapter 11, you'll see 2 witnesses, which are ultimately the Old and New Testament, but it also typifies what God's people will do during the 1260 years period. Not everyone will succumb to Catholicism. God will always have a remnant. And you can see there from 538 to 1798, what we call the Dark Ages, that period of time, which is typified by the Thyatiran period of 7 churches. Those are some of the portions of Scripture above that timeline that will help you to maybe better understand the experience of God's people during that time. It points back to the story of Elijah and Jezebel and Ahab. So if we want to better understand the 1260 and what the church goes through during the 1260 period, one good story to plug into is 1 Kings. I believe it's the end of chapter 17 when Ahab and Elijah get married. If my memory serves. No, sorry, Ahab and Jezebel get married. And when you look at Elijah's experience, his experience as a whole typifies the Christian dispensation. Just some food for thought. So verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the Holy Covenant, those who reject Bible teachers, shall heed the papacy corrupt by flatteries, yea, as God said, touching on Genesis chapter 3. But the people who do know their God shall be strong. God has a remnant, always has a remnant, and they will keep the truth alive. That's the exploits. And verse 33, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, by spoil many days. The many days there is a reference to the 1260. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, but just study it for yourselves and you'll see that the many days is the 1260. Now during the 1260, you have a lot of persecution. A lot of people fall by the sword. The ERV reads, those wise teachers will help the other people understand what is happening, but even they will have to suffer persecution. Some of them will be killed with swords, some of them will be burned or taken prisoner, some of them will have their homes and things taken away. Verse 33 refers to sword, captivity, and spoil many days. And when you look at Revelation 13 verses 5 and 10 referring to the 1260, you see the same language. So God's people are going to be pressured for 42 months, which is another way of saying 1260. And you see the same language in verse 10, captivity, sword and killed and all of these different things. So the many days in the verse that we've just looked at, it's a reference to it's another way of saying the 1260. It's another way of saying the 1260. And again, Daniel 7 verse 20, you got references to the wearing out of the saints of the Most High, an attack on times and laws. And then you got another way of saying 1260, times, and the dividing of a time. Again, Revelation 11 and verse 3, just to double, triple, quadruple down. 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy, clothed in sackcloth, 1,260 days. Miller talks about the thing, Josiah Litch also. So verse 33, and they, God's people, you could probably plug in the Waldensians, the Huguenots, the Albigenses, that understand among the people in Christendom, shall instruct many. We know the stories of the Waldensians, yet they shall fall by the sword. We know that they were persecuted by flame, you've got Inquisition and so on and so forth. Some will have their homes and things taken away, bribery, flattery. So lots of things are happening during the 1260, resulting in the persecution of God's people. Verse 34, now when they shall fall, they shall be open with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. What's going on here? Now, again, some references here. You'll see A.T. Jones and what he says about that. There are different ideas relational to the open with a little help, and we'll explore them very briefly. Some suggest it was the Reformation, others suggest it's the opening up of America so that the Christians could flee papal persecution. They could leave Europe and go to the Americas. I think it's a combination of both. So if you read through the different quotes, you've got Josiah Litch, A.T. Jones, and Uriah Smith. James White also comments on that in relation to the open with a little help. And also a guy called, really good book, Facts of Faith. This is by a guy called Christian Edwardson. Recommend the book. He talks about how God's people helped with a little help. Like Luther, for example, he was helped by the princes when he was on trial at Spires. They protested against his treatment at the hands of the papacy. This is where you get the term Protestant from. And the protest of the princes, good chapter in Great Controversy, is the protest of the princes, which talks about where the word Protestant comes from. So God always made sure that his faithful servants were helped, open with a little help. Again, Christian Edwardson talking about that. A lot of good information in his book. They'll open with a little help. You can see Revelation 12 verse 14. God gives his people 2 wings as an eagle, which means providence, and they're protected and nourished for a times and half a time. Serpent casts water out of his mouth to try and basically destroy the church, and the earth helps the woman. I can't go into it, but Revelation 13 talks about a beast coming up out of the earth. And we know that Revelation 13 beast represents the United States, and the United States Constitution helps the woman in the sense that separation of church and state is written into the Constitution, helping God's people. Verse 34, now that shall fall, they shall be open with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. So the Reformation begins. God helps his people. What happens is not everyone who becomes a part of the Reformation is converted. And so the Reformation kind of stutters to a certain degree because people connect themselves to the revelation, having not really come out of Rome fully. This is why later on there's a need for Adventism, because the Protestant churches kind of fall short because people cleave to them with flatteries. There's still a bit of papacy in the Reformation or in the Protestant churches. So flattery cleaves. Remember, flattery is connected to what the papacy does. So the Reformation kind of stutters because of papal doctrines that are carried over into the Protestant churches. And so verse 34, now when they, the faithful described in the previous verses, shall fall, be persecuted, they shall be open with a little help. The Reformation, USA opened up. Also the Islamic attack on Europe, which distracted the papacy, the reformers to preach unhindered to a certain degree. The Mohammedans came up and attacked Europe, taking Spain and other portions of Europe. And that kind of distracted the papal forces so that the Reformation could gain ahead of steam. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries, hypocrisy, and compromise will continue. Reformation yet to be completed. Verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for an appointed time. We'll see later on that the time of the end is a reference to 1798. And so persecution kind of arises a second time. And that's a lot to do with the Reformation and what we call the Counter-Reformation. Counter-Reformation into the time of the end, which would be 1798, as we'll see. We can see here in Daniel 12, verse 4, there's a reference to the time of the end. And there's a question, how long shall be these wonders? How long shall it be to the end of these wonders, or until the time of the end? I know I'm speaking fast, bear with me. And the answer given in relation to when the time of the end will come is another reference to a times and a half, or the 1260. So the time of the end is also a reference to an end of a time prophecy, so 1798. And Ellen White, she kind of ratifies that in Great Controversy, 355, paragraph 3, and 356, paragraph 1. You've got that all in your notes. To purge them, to make them white. And so this persecution actually helps the church. Consider it not strange the fiery trial. And this period here kind of corresponds with the 5th seal of Revelation chapter 6, when it talks about white robes were given and so on. And you can see a reference also to the Sardis period, which corresponds with the Reformation in Revelation chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. And you can see there the reference to that period in Revelation chapter 6, from verses 9 through to 11. So you can see that the churches and the seals correspond or kind of parallel Daniel 11. William Miller talks about the period, and you'll read what he says about the purged and made white. Josiah Litch, he's got his points of view. Some of them that have understanding shall fall. You got the Counter-Reformation, the re-emergence of persecution, to try them and to purge them and to make them white. Shake out hypocrites. And I'll put a question mark there, but I'm going to remove the question mark in my mind, because the Reformation, it's easy to be a Christian when it's easy to be a Christian, if you know what I mean. By that I mean, when there's no persecution, it's easy to be a Christian. Christianity flourished in Rome after 313, when the Edict of Milan was signed by Licinius and Constantine. It was easy to be a Christian because there was no longer persecution, even to the time of the end of 1798, because it is yet for a time appointed. And so there's a time appointed, that 1798, when certain things cease, when the papacy receives a deadly wound and state power is taken away from it. Verses 36 to 39, and the king shall do according to his will. Now, this is the king of the north, or the pope, shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. That's a reference there to the deadly wound in 1798. That which is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and the God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and with pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the strongholds, in the most strongholds, with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Litch goes into these particular verses, and Litch's view is that he kind of focuses on France being the king of the north at this point in time. And if you read through that quote, you'll see his reasoning. The problems with this view is that the king of the north is the focus. We'll see that France is connected to the king of the south. So what I'm basically doing is, some of the pioneers of the Advent movement, because they didn't have hindsight as we do, they believed that the king of the north in verses 36 to 39 was France. But what we'll see with hindsight, we can look back and see there's a problem there, because eventually we'll see that France is actually connected to the kingdom of the south. So France can't be the kingdom of the south and the north, because the kingdom of the south and the north are always against each other. And we'll see that French actually push at the actual king of the north in 1798 and take away political power from the papacy. So France can't be the king of the north. France is actually a portion of, or a part of, or connected to the kingdom of the south. And we can see that Paul actually quotes from verse 36, and he's clearly dealing with the man of sin, or the papacy. Verse 36, and the king shall do according to his will and shall magnify himself. This is where Paul quoted from in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And it's a reference to what the papacy is going to do. And we see here where Paul kind of quotes from Daniel 11 and verse 36, more so in verse 4 of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, referring to the man of sin. And when we look at what Daniel prior to 11 says about this man of sin, look at what Daniel 7 and verse 8 talks about when referring to this little horn that has the eyes of a man and so on, speaks great things. Verse 25, amplifying verse 8, speaks great things or words against the Most High, thinks to change times and laws, and reigns for a time and divided of a time. But France doesn't fulfill any of these identifying criteria. Revelation 13, referring to the same entity, speaks great words or things and blasphemies, continues for 42 months. He opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in heaven. That's all pointing towards the papacy. So the king of the north at no point in time can represent France or Napoleon or any French leader. move through. William Miller talking about it, referring to the little horn Antichrist. Read these quotes in your own time. As I said, I'm trying to get through to a point where I can deal with verses 40 to 45. You can see here the Great Controversy, 1888 version, paragraph 1 of page 50, highlights that the papacy is Satan's masterpiece. And I'm not going to go into all of this, but if you read through the notes that are connected to the PowerPoint, you'll see where I'm going with this. Just want to highlight the fact that the papacy is Satan's masterpiece. Very quickly, you see in Revelation 13, a reference to a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns, and this is the beast through which Satan attacks God's people right at the end of time. Satan's mindset is highlighted in Isaiah 14, verses 13 and 14. And what we see, because in Isaiah 14, you've got Satan in heaven. What you have in Revelation 12 is a symbolic reference to Satan in heaven. Because what we see after verse 3 is a reference to a war in heaven. We're looking at Revelation chapter 12. And so the red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, it kind of typifies Satan as an entity symbolically. And what we see Satan do, and we're looking at the masterpiece of Satan's power, when you look at Revelation 13 verses 1 and 2, you see a replica beast, but it's made up of different entities. So it's not a great red dragon, though it has 7 heads and 10 horns. What Satan's done is taken a bit of Babylon, mouth of the lion. He's taken a bit of Medo-Persia, the feet of the bear. He's taken a bit of Grecia, the body of a leopard. So he's kind of replicated himself through certain entities on earth. And those entities on earth he speaks through, saying the same thing as he said in heaven, saying the same thing that he said to Eve when he approached her via a serpent in the garden. So we see that the papacy is Satan's masterpiece. He's took a bit of Babylon, he's took a bit of Medo-Persia, he's took a bit of Grecia, he's taken a bit of pagan Rome, and he's put it all together. And he uses this entity, this symbolic beast, to do what he started in heaven, to continue what he started in heaven, and what he continued to do when on earth through a literal serpent in the garden when tempting Eve. So verse 36, and the king, the popes, shall do according to his or their will. And he, the popes, when I say he or they, let me say they shall exalt themselves and magnify themselves. Popes will magnify themselves above every god, shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished. I mean, that's 1798, but it's also the time when God deals with them. So it's a twofold thing in the sense that they get dealt with in 1798, but they also get dealt with at the end of time. For that which is determined shall be done. The word determined there is a reference to like the deadly wound. But the papacy is going to the papacy dies in 1798, but is resurrected. But the papacy will eventually die and not be resurrected, if that makes sense. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. Now, Lich talking about the papacy in relation to what it says in the verse, nor the desire of women. He talks about the vows of celibacy. So this is kind of going into, to a certain degree, what kind of things the papacy would do, having established itself, vows of celibacy, and the papacy kind of claiming himself to be Pontifex Maximus, which is a reference to, the bridge builder between the gods. That was a title that was given to the emperors. It was adopted by the popes. And so that was like a claim to say that I'm above all. Because in the pagan religion, you had a pantheon of gods, different gods over which the emperor would kind of reign. Same with the papacy. Remember Revelation 17 and verse 5, mother of harlots and the abominations of the earth. When you look at what Hebrew or Uriah Smith is saying here, it's just elaborating on what I was talking about a little while ago. You've got a prophecy relational to forbidden to marry and so on and so forth that's connected to the papacy. So neither shall he regard the God of his fathers as the true and living God, nor the desire of women, vows of celibacy. I'll put a question mark there because I think that's what it's alluding to, but I can't say for sure. Neither regard any God, even false gods. So he's magnified himself above all, that is all gods. It's the attitude of Satan, as described in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, played out through the papacy, Satan's masterpiece. Verse 38, when in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and the God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold, silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Now, who is this God of forces? The LEB, the Lexham English Bible, reads it this way, but instead he will honor the God of fortresses. So not the God of forces, but the God of fortresses. Same thing is referred to in the Revised Version. And Young's literal translation, the God of strongholds. Now, I'm going to lean upon a book that I've had for the longest time. It's a bit of a tricky book to get your head around because of the way it's written, but it's got a lot of information when it comes to Catholicism. Now, what he, that is Alexander Hislop, writes is that you've got a God of forces, which is actually a goddess of fortresses or a goddess of fortifications. Now, this goddess of forces or fortresses is none other than Semiramis, the wife of Ninus or the wife of Nimrod. And so it's actually a goddess of fortresses. Now, in the same book, Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, page 55, you'll see what happens is that the papacy venerates this goddess or this queen of heaven, which is Babylonian or Babylonian in origin. And what you see begin to happen in Catholicism, especially around about the Council of Trent in the 16th century. I've got a book here called The Myth of Mary by Caesar Vidal, pages 138 going into page 140. What begins to happen where the papacy is concerned is the veneration of Mary, and it's basically the Christianization of the Queen of Heaven, who was known by the pagans as the god or goddess of fortresses. Yeah. And you've got images of saints and so on and so forth referred to, and the saints would be, covered with gold and silver and precious stones and so on. And so there's verse 38, but in his estate, the Catholic Church shall honor the god of fortresses or the goddess of fortresses or forces. That's Mary. I'm touching on the fact that this is the veneration of Mary. It has to be somewhere in the prophecy because Mary becomes co-redemptrix. You can go to her, and it was established at the Council of Trent in around 1546. You can go to her and ask her for forgiveness. Ask her for forgiveness. So it's actually a goddess and not a god. God masculine, it's a goddess feminine, whom his fathers knew not, and shall he honor with gold and with silver, with precious stones and precious. So who does Catholicism really venerate more than Jesus? It's Mary. It's Mary. We can't argue with that fact. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. Now, what's interesting here is the papacy. Its seat of power is described as a stronghold, or not so much its seat of power, but the papacy is looking to deal with strongholds. And we see the same thing happen where pagan Rome was concerned. So papal Rome deals with other nations or strongholds from a seat of power. That's exactly what papal Rome eventually, or pagan Rome rather, eventually did when they finally subjugated the fourth province of Alexander's kingdom, that was Egypt, which was controlled for a time by the Ptolemies. So verse 24, we saw that in part, I believe it was part 3. When we looked at that, I'm not going to go into this for time's sake, you can refer to the notes. So pagan and papal. Pagan Rome deals with the nations, the strongholds from the city of Rome, even for a time or the 360 years. So pagan Rome deals with things for a time period of 360 years, from 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, to 330 when Constantine removes himself from Rome to Constantinople. Papal Rome deals with the nations or the strongholds from the city of Rome or the Vatican for a time and times in the divided of a time, or 1,260 years. We see references here, William Miller referring to strange gods and the images and idols that are in various places. I mean, if you've ever went to Croatia a number of years ago, it's a very Catholic country, and there are lots of images wherever you go, and you can pray to these images and confess your sins to the different saints and so on, or ask them to mediate for you. And we know the Bible says the dead know not anything. This part here, verse 39, when it says, and he shall cause them to rule over many and shall divide the land for gain. I've been wrestling with this for a while. You can look at the different versions here, and how they write it, or how they render the verse, and you'll see that it kind of alludes to the papacy giving kings a portion of land and them having to pay tribute to the papacy. and to pay tribute to the papacy. Revelation 17, we see here that the papacy grows rich, and we see that again in Revelation 18, she's rich and she's very wealthy. So you can see in verse 39, the papacy gaining a lot of wealth, and we see here the control that the papacy has over the kings of the earth, and so the papacy is gaining a lot of wealth. And I also allude to the fact, or I'm not alluding to the fact, I'm suggesting that the dividing the land for gain has something to do with colonialism. Check out this in your own time. Pope Alexander the Sixth, check out his name, issues a papal bull or decree called Inter Cetera, in which he authorizes Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as subjects. The decree asserts the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave. It also justifies enslavement of Africans. So what we see where colonialism is concerned, which was ratified by the papacy in his decree or bull Inter Cetera, was that the Americas and the continent of Africa, they were divided up by the European nations for gain. The reason why Europe is wealthy is because they've taken the gold and silver from the Americas, and the gold and silver and other things. One of the precious things came out of Africa, came out of the Americas into Europe. And there's a website here you can check out. You can see the link at the bottom. The old European mercantile economy was shaken by the massive injection of American wealth. In 1500, Europe had $200 million worth of gold and silver. A century later, after the conquistadors and others had gone to different parts of the world, that amount was 8 times greater. So times 200 million by 8. Inflation said so. So basically, what we see is this influx of merchandise, of wealth coming into Europe, because Africa and the Americas have been divided up, ratified by the papacy for gain. And this will kind of lead later on to a point where you'll see in verse 43, the papacy has control of the gold and the silver and the precious things of Egypt. Egypt in that context to find the world. So this shall he, the papacy, do in the strongholds or the nations. Papacy will deal blows to other nation with a strange god, Satan, idolatry, Mary, saints, etc. Whom he, the papacy, shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And he, the papacy, shall cause the kings of the nations to rule over many people, nations, and tongues, etc. The kings could only be kings if the papacy allowed them to be, and shall divide the land for gain. Rulers pay him for the land they rule over and or the privilege of ruling. And also colonialism, which resulted in the dividing up of, because you look at the borders in South America, they weren't the borders that were in place before the Europeans went there. You look at the borders in Africa, they weren't the borders in place before the Europeans went there. And what has happened since? Gold and silver and precious things taken from the Americas, gold and precious things taken from Africa and elsewhere in the world. We're going to go into the last 6 verses now, verses 40 through to 45. And I know we're moving at breakneck speed, but I want to get through to the end. And I'm praying that you utilize the notes, because a lot of what I'm saying quickly, you'll see in the notes. And we'll see in selected messages, manuscript releases, volume 13, page 394, paragraph 1. One of the only places where Ellen White refers to the 11th of Daniel, and she says that these portions of the prophecy have nearly reached their complete fulfillment. And she refers to verses 31 to 36, and she says that there'll be a repeat scene similar to those described in these words, quoting verses 31 to 36. In manuscript releases, they will often put the text quoted in brackets to save paper. So basically what she would do, she would write, and she would quote texts, but they were removed when they printed certain things to save paper. So you've got she would quote verses 31 to 36. Then she would say, scenes similar to those described in these words will take place. So scenes similar to verses 31 and 36 will take place. So when the papacy rose the first time, there'll be a kind of a repeat, or scenes similar will take place in relation to the papacy's second rise. Now remember, certain entities have to be removed, certain things have to be overcome for the papacy to rise the first time. And then the papacy changes times and laws and so on and so forth. But bear in mind this, for the most part, what we've been looking at from verses 1 to 39 is Gabriel giving a literal description of what's going on. So when he says the king of the north, he's referring to a literal king of the north, and whoever that king of the north is, is determined by who has conquered at that time. We're at the point now where the king of the north is the papacy. Verse 4 of Daniel 12 talks about the sealing of the book, even to the time of the end. So what I'm suggesting is you've got a reference here to a portion of Daniel's prophecy being sealed up, even to the time of the end. Now, how does God seal things up? God seals things up using symbols. And so what we see from verse 40 onwards is a switch, because the time of the end has something to do with the sealing up of the prophecy. And we see in verse 40, as we'll look at in a little while, that these are events that are connected to the time of the end. So what we're going to begin to see from verse 40 onwards is the use of symbolism, because verses 40 to 45, which deal with the time of the end, is sealed up. And it's sealed up symbolically. And we see that many run to and fro, which refers to Bible study running to and fro in the Bible, and knowledge is increased. So only after 1798 can you understand the latter portion of Daniel's prophecy. Selected Messages, volume 2, page 105 reads, the book that was sealed was not the book of Revelation, but that portion of the prophecy of Daniel which relates to the last days, verses 40 to 45. The scripture says, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book into the time of the end, 1798. Many shall run to and fro, knowledge shall be increased. Quoted from Daniel 12, verse 4. When the book was opened, the proclamation was made, there shall be time no longer. See Revelation 10:6. The book of Daniel is now unsealed, and the revelation made by Christ to John is to come to all the inhabitants of the earth by the increase of knowledge. A people is to be prepared to stand in the latter day. Now, the increase of knowledge has something to do with the opening up of verses 40 to 45, and it says that this increase of knowledge, this wisdom that comes from the sealed up portion of the book of Daniel, will help to prepare the people to stand in the latter day. So this is why we have to study this book, specifically, or not specifically verses 40 to 45, but we need to put special emphasis on them. So I'm looking at verse 40 and part A, and I'm still going to have to move at breakneck speed. So in your own time, go through the notes. They're very detailed, and I know you'll learn a lot by the grace of God. I, when preparing these notes, stood on the shoulders of Uriah Smith, Josiah Litch, A.T. Jones, and a number of other writers, and I'm grateful for what they did. I stood on their shoulders in the sense that they didn't have Google, they didn't have like laptop that I'm using here. They didn't even have electricity like we do. They would have candlelight, they would have lamps, and they would have to read the actual books. They didn't have word processors. They couldn't cut and paste. So what I've done, I've read their books, and I've copied and pasted what they said, having gone through their works into this document. So I've lent upon what they did, and I'm hoping that you guys will lean upon what I have done. You ladies and gentlemen will lean upon what I have done. And go into it and study for yourself. They did a lot of legwork that I was blessed by. I've done a lot of legwork that I'm hoping you guys will be blessed by, that you ladies and gentlemen, you brothers and sisters will be blessed by. So part A, and at the time of the end, that's 1798, shall the king of the south, now look, the king of the south, singular, shall push at him, that is the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him, that is the king of the south, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, plural, so the king of the south is singular at first, in this portion of Daniel 11, but then there's a switch from singular to plural. Now that's important. So king of the south, singular, there's a switch where the king of the south is concerned. It's a switch from singular king to a group of countries, plural, and shall overflow. So what we see in verse 40 in a nutshell is a king of the south comes into or pushes at the papacy, the king of the north, the pope, the king of the north. But then the king of the north is going to come back at the king of the south, or the kingdom of the south, when the kingdom of the south is made up of many countries, and the king of the north shall prevail. That's it in a nutshell. So at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. This is part A. So what happens in fulfillment of this portion of the text? We've looked at the time of the end before using these verses. It could also be read as the time of the end of a time prophecy. And we know that the end of the time prophecy that's being referred to it's the 1260, rendered in different ways in 7 different verses, primarily for exclusively found in the books of Daniel and the Revelation. 7 times the 1260 appears in different forms in the books of Daniel and the Revelation. So the time of the end that's referred to in verse 40 is the end of a time, and the end of the time is the end of the 1260, which takes us to, or brings us to 1798. Now, what we see happening in 1798 and we see a quote here from the Great Controversy, page 266, paragraph 3, is the French enter into the Vatican City and take the Pope prisoner. I think it's Pius VI, if my memory serves me correctly, and they dissolve the papal government. That's the king, because Napoleon, he sends Berthier into the Vatican City. You can see on the graphic here. So on the 10th of February, sometimes I mix it up and say the 11th, 1798, the French army under Berthier entered Rome, took possession of the city, and made the Pope and the Cardinal prisoners. That's Pope Pius VI, if I believe. Napoleon, who was the king of the south at the time. And the thing is, what's interesting is Napoleon, before he sends Berthier into the Vatican City, he actually takes control of Egypt in a literal sense. Remember that the Kingdom of the South is connected to Egypt. So you see in 538 a union of church and state. And it's interesting that the Franks helped to make that possible. Bovis was instrumental in getting rid of paganism, and he was one of the first of the 10 kings to convert to Catholicism. So the Franks, who became the French, they're instrumental in putting the Pope on the throne. And it's the French, who were once the Franks, were instrumental in taking the papacy off of the throne at the time of the Endor in 1798. And so from 1798, you can see on the graphic here, which is the time of the end, verses 40 to 45 have their fulfillment after 1798, culminating with the close of probation, as depicted in Daniel 12 and verse 1. So Daniel 11, verse 40, part 8, highlights events connected to the year 1798, or the close of the 1260-year prophecy. Revelation chapter 11 highlights events relating to the French Revolution of the 1790s in connection with 1798 AD. See chapter 15 of the Great Controversy, which is entitled The Bible and the French Revolution. I can't recommend that enough if you want to understand Revelation 11 and the King of the South pushing out the King of the North in 1798. The chapter to read is The Bible of the French Revolution in the book The Great Controversy. France is likened to Sodom and Egypt in that particular prophecy. And that's important because remember, Egypt is synonymous with the Kingdom of the South. And Egypt was the literal Kingdom of the South. France is now the spiritual king or the Kingdom of the South. And the push at him is a reference to what happened in 1798. I hope all that is clear. Lessons from literal Egypt. Now, this is important because we're seeing France likened to Egypt. So we need to look at the nature of Egypt. Nature of Egypt, Exodus 5 verse 2, and Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. And what Sister White says in Great Controversy, page 442 in paragraph 1, the speaking of the nation, she's speaking about the lamb-like beast here, is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. So the Pharaoh is the speaking of the nation in the sense that he's basically saying there's no God. So to a certain degree, or at least when you apply it in one way, Egypt can represent atheism in the sense that it's the denial of God. And that's important. If you look at Uriah Smith's Daniel in the Revelation, page 532, paragraph 6, you'll see that France, he likens France, and I think rightfully so, when it's called spiritual Egypt, he highlights the fact that France is an atheistical power. Now, France was the first of the European nations to kind of, I suppose you could say, form what was like a politicized form of atheism that represented what Pharaoh said. And if you look at the latter portion of the quote, yes, France in a national capacity, she denied the being of God and made war on the monarchy of heaven. So France, what they did, they actually made laws against the Bible in around 1793. They created a political form of atheism, and that was very influential. 1790s France was very influential. A lot of free thinkers were around at that time, and they kind of began to form a lot of ideology that's prevalent today in certain political movements. We see Great Controversy. Sister White saying, well, the same as what Uriah Smith had said as well. We see here that reference in Revelation 11 to that 3.5 years period during which time the Bible was made illegal. You can see there, Ellen White in Great Controversy 287. In 1793, an official decree was made to abolish, and so they made a state law that we're going to ban the Bible. we're going to ban the Bible. So they really were atheistic, a politicized form of atheism. So what became the ideology? What became of the ideology of 1790s France? What became of atheism or politicized atheism? Questions. What atheistic ideology arose after the French Revolution? Was this ideology incorporated into government? What did this politicized atheistic ideology become known as? And it was communism. If you look at Karl Marx and you see how he was influenced, and he was the one who wrote the Communist Manifesto, which eventually was adopted by certain, Eastern Europeans, namely Russia. And they began to form a politicized form of atheism, and they called it communism, socialism to some. Part A is all to do with France going into Vatican City as a politicized atheistic force. They make laws that outlaw the Bible and so on and so forth. So you've got this politicized form of atheism. They deal a death blow to the papacy. But what we see in Revelation chapter 11 is that France repents and rescinds certain laws, and they no longer are a politicized atheistic power. And what we see happening, which is important, is that communism is born from the ashes of 1790s France. So when the papacy is going to push back, it's pushing back at the politicized atheism that was born in 1790s France. This is where part B comes in. The king of the north shall come against him, who is to him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries. Remember the pluralization of the king of the south, in the sense that we've got countries connected to the kingdom of the south. And what you see with communism is communism spreads, and you've got what was called the USSR, Union of Soviet Social Republics. So you have all of these different nations that make up the communist bloc. It's this massive amount of nations that are basically politicized atheism that was born in 1790s France. This is what the papacy is going to push back at, using chariots, horsemen, and many ships. So what do these chariots and these horsemen and many ships represent? When you look at 1 Kings chapter 5, you'll see that chariots and horsemen are to do with war, military might. And you'll see the same thing in 1 Kings 20 and verse 1. And in Psalm 107 and verse 23, you've got a reference to ships as it relates to trade. So the ships, the horsemen, and the chariots, they're reference to military and economic might. Now, what you'll have in your presentations that you get, some quotes from around the time when communism collapsed toward the end of the 80s, going into 1990. And you'll see references in different, like Reader's Digest here, to military might, American troops. So what's happening during what we call the Cold War was this arms race. You had like Vietnam, when the Vietnamese were funded by the communists, and then you had Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen were funded by the Americans, and all of these different things were happening. It was like an arms race, military build-up, and so on and so forth. You've got JF Kennedy, Bay of Pitt, all of these different things. There was like this military tension between the Soviets, or politicized atheism, the USSR, and the West, America, who were kind of being, to a certain degree, that especially in the 80s, you got Pope John Paul II and Reagan coming together, and you see references here to military might. In the Time magazine and Reader's Digest, again around the time the Soviet bloc began to collapse, you got references to economic pressure and so on and so forth. So read through these quotes. They're all a fulfillment of the second part of verse 40 of Daniel 11. And so when it talks about the chariots, the horsemen, and the many ships, that's a reference to the papacy coming back via the United States, especially in the 80s, to get back at politicized atheism. Because remember, it's always a tit for tat between the king of the north and the south. So a form of politicized atheism dealt with the papacy in 1798. Papacy is coming back to get politicized atheism in the form of the Soviet Union in the 80s, going into 89 when the Berlin Wall falls, and then 90 when the Soviet bloc actually collapses. He shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Again, references here to what the papacy did in relation to Marxism and the Soviet bloc. If you read through those, you'll see certain things that the papacy did. You've got this pushing here. Remember, the papacy pushes back. You've got a tide washing over Eastern Europe. Papacy going in there, and along with America's help economically and militarily, the Eastern Bloc begins to collapse. You see in Time magazine that the coming together of Reagan, the president of the United States, and Pope John Paul II is called an holy alliance, which will hasten the demise of communism, and it actually felt a death blow beginning in September of 1989, those of us who are old enough to remember, the Berlin Wall was broken down and reported all over the world. And so verse 40, at the time of the end, 1798, shall the king of the south, atheistic France, a form of politicized atheism, shall push or remove state power from the papacy, and the king of the north or the papacy will come back at him against politicized atheism in the form of communism, like a whirlwind with chariots and with horse for military might, primarily the United States, economic strength, the many ships, primarily the United States, and he shall enter into the countries, the Eastern Bloc, and shall overflow and pass over, liberate them from communism. And a lot of these nations, they were very heavily Catholicized before they were became communists, and so they returned wholeheartedly back to Catholicism. Okay, so he shall enter into the glorious land. I'm going to have to move very quickly because I'm looking at the time. And many countries shall be overthrown. Now, bear in mind that the word countries is italicized, so it doesn't belong to the text. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall enter into the glorious land. What is the glorious land? Where is the glorious land? Daniel 11 and verse 16. You got a reference to the glorious land, it being Palestine. So is it literal Palestine or is it something else? The above verse describes what pagan Rome did in relation to the literal land of Palestine, once called Canaan. Will the papacy occupy or enter into literal Palestine? If the glorious land of verse 41 is literal Palestine, then things get complicated. And who are the literal Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites? Now, remember what I said. Things relational to the time of the end are wrapped up or sealed up in symbols. So we're not looking for a literal application where the glorious land is concerned, nor are we looking to identify literal Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites. So it's all symbols now. So what does this glorious land symbolize? Who are these Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites? And what we see here is, and I'm not going to read this, all of it for time's sake, but 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 46, referring to the cross as a hinge. Before the cross, you had that which was natural, and after that which was spiritual. An example of that, before the cross, you had a literal sanctuary on earth. After the cross, you've got a spiritual sanctuary in heaven. Before the cross, you had literal lambs. After the cross, you would go to the spiritual lamb, the Lamb of God, which is Jesus, who takes away the sins of the world. You've got a reference to that there. The glorious land of Palestine was to the Jews a safe haven, a place of refuge, a place entered into after the wilderness experience. Did the church have a similar experience? Did the church have a similar experience? I'm not going to read these texts, read them in your own time, but basically what happens where God's people are concerned, in Israel, the Israelites go into Egypt, they have their dark age during that period. They come out of Egypt and they're taken into a glorious land where they're able to worship God freely. They're given a sanctuary, they're given health message and so on and so forth. Same thing happens to basically, I'm going to go through these things quickly. So when I get to the point where I can just identify it. You read through these quotes, you'll see why America is the glorious land, in the sense that what happens where God's people are concerned in America, the Christians reach America, eventually Adventism is formed, and you've got a return into sanctuary truths, the Sabbath. So everything that the Israelites were given, having come out of Egypt, in America, God's people were given, having come out of the Dark Ages, having come out of Europe, where the papacy was oppressing people, just as Pharaoh oppressed the people in Egypt, the papacy oppressed the people in Europe. So the glorious land of verse 41 is a reference to the United States. And it's glorious because of its constitution, which separates church and state. And you can see these different quotes there, different references to why America is a glorious land, I believe. And we see here that the dragon, or rather the lamb-like beast, will eventually speak as a dragon. And this is the entering into the glorious land of the papacy. Because initially the papacy set up, or rather the United States set up by God, was glorious in the sense it had the constitution, but it will eventually speak as a dragon. This is when the papacy enters into the glorious land. When the papacy enters into the glorious land, and you've got references to speaking great words against the Most High. And many countries, remember the word countries is italicized, so it's a reference to many people, I believe, shall be overthrown. Many people shall be overthrown. So when the papacy enters into the glorious land and America begins to speak as a dragon, many people shall be overthrown. Many individuals will be overthrown by ultimately the Sunday law. Some will receive the mark on their forehead, others on their right hand. And it's like an ongoing gradual process, as we'll see as we go through the verses. But it refers to individuals escaping out of the papacy's hand. But touching on the many shall be overthrown, you can kind of look on verses that we looked at earlier, in relation to Eve's overthrow and the young man of Proverbs 7 his overthrow. Those who are overthrown haven't really hidden the word in their heart. They're the foolish virgins who have no oil for the most part. Of Matthew 25, you've got some quotes here referring to why certain people are overthrown. So in your own time, read through those quotes. And you've got another one there. And you've got what happens in Matthew or Daniel chapter 3 in relation to the Jews as a whole. Most of the Jews in Babylon are overthrown, but there are certain Jews who stay true to the faith. And what we see in the latter portion of verse 41 is the reference to people escaping out of the papacy's hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Now, basically, when you look at Edom, they're the children of Esau. The Moabites and the Ammonites are the children of Lot. So these are individuals who are very closely related to Israel. So they have a form of religion that's very close to Israel. These are the people who hearken unto the second angel's message and come out of her, my people, and Babylon is fallen. So these are the people from the different churches who are they're not altogether right in what they believe, but they listen to the loud cry and they come out of the fallen churches. You can see references to what happens, what I call the great escape in these references here. So verse 41, he, the papacy, shall enter both religiously and politically. That's a reference to the image of the beast, also of Revelation 13 and 14. Into the glorious land, the USA, and many nominal believers shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, the papacy or the image of the beast's hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon, those of over the folds, and it's a response to come out of her, my people. And he shall stretch forth his hand upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So using America as a platform, he then begins to finally conquer for all time the kingdom of the south, which basically constitutes the world at this time for the most part. And we see here in Testimonies Volume 1 that the world and Egypt are connected. And we see the same thing referred to in Sign of the Times, March 6th, dated 1884. And what we see in Revelation 13 and 16 and 17 is a reference to the kings of the earth succumbing to the influence of the papacy, using America as a platform, the image of the beast. So things start in America, and then everyone else in the world follows suit. So you got certain dragon-like speak coming from America, namely the getting rid of the Constitution and the formalization of a Sunday law, and the rest of the world begin to follow suit. So you've got this gradual emergence of a little time of trouble, culminating with Daniel 12 and verse 1. And in these quotes there, you'll see that things start in America and then spread throughout the world. And that's the fulfillment of he stretches forth, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So he, the papacy, using the image of the beast of the United States, shall stretch forth his hands from the United States, also upon the countries and many nations that make up the world. The land of Egypt, world, shall not escape. The king or the kingdom of the south is vanquished once and for all. Verse 43, but he, the papacy, shall have power of the treasure and the gold and the precious things of Egypt. Now remember what the papacy did in verse 39, divided the land for gain. Economic crash in 2008 gave it even more power. And basically, as you go through Revelation 13, you'll see a reference in verse 17 to people's rights to buy and sell being taken away. In order for that to be a reality, the papacy has to have control over the gold and the silver and the precious things of Egypt or the world. And it refers to the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now, who are these Libyans and the Ethiopians? There's a reference, the only other reference I can find in the scripture of Libyans and Ethiopians in the same context is in Jeremiah 46 and verse 9, and they're referred to as mighty men. They're referred to as mighty men. So the papacy is going to have mighty men on his side. Or in other words, they're going to have arms standing on their part, just as Nebuchadnezzar had in Daniel chapter 3, when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they basically stood up against Nebuchadnezzar's decree in chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar commanded the most mighty men, or arms, his strongest arms, to bind them and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Do the same in spiritual Babylon. Military might will be used to oppress people. If financial restraints don't work, then mighty men will be employed. Mighty men will be employed. And some people refer to the Ethiopians and the Libyans as the rich and the poor, the free and the bond. And that's how you could probably look at Revelation 13 and verse 16, applying that thought there. So verse 43, but he, the kingdom of the north, or the king of the north, papacy, combination of the enemies of God's people, shall have power over the treasures and of the gold and silver, the economy, the world economy. And it's no, look at all of the economies of the world are now combined. And we're in a position as never before to control people financially. And so the things of Egypt, of the world, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be his steps. Could be a reference to rich and poor, but I think it's more so a reference to mighty men. But tidings out of the east and the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. So papacy is doing all that he's doing, but then tidings or a message out of the east and the north trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth. So he's gone into America, he's doing what he's doing, he's controlling the world. But then a message, tidings out of the east and the north, are going to trouble him. And he's going to try and destroy those who bring the tidings out of the north. So what are these tidings out of the east and the north? Amos chapter 8, verses 11 and 12 refers to a famine in the land right at the end of time. And the famine is connected to the hearing of the words of the Lord. Now, people seek the Lord. And where do they go to find the word of the Lord? What you see is they run to the north and the east. And tidings out the east and the north trouble the papacy. So a heaven-sent message is going to trouble the papacy. The heaven-sent message is going to trouble the papacy. And we see here a seeking for the word of the Lord. And we see there's a time in Revelation, or rather Daniel 12 and verse 4, where it's possible running to and fro for knowledge to increase. A time will come, though, when even though you run to and fro, there won't be an increase in knowledge because the spirit has been removed and it's no longer possible to understand the truth. So it's vitally important that we study these truths now that we might understand them while the spirit is still on offer. Revelation 18 and verses 1 and 2 refers to the loud cry. These tidings out of the east and the north, they're referred to. It's the loud cry. It's the swelling of the loud cry of Revelation 18, when the fourth angel joins the third angel, and you've got this loud cry, and all the gospel, basically the gospel is preaching all the world for a witness before the end comes. Look at Great Controversy 6:11. You'll see the whole earth is lightened with the glory of this message. Again, look at these quotes, and you'll see that it's the loud cry that troubles the papacy. It's the loud cry that troubles the papacy. And the papacy's response is ultimately the fulfillment of Revelation 12:17, where he goes to make war with, it's the death decree and so on and so forth, that the final push of the papacy to prevent the third angel's message from going forth, coupled with the Revelation 18 message. And what they actually do empowers the message. It empowers the message. If you read through Great Controversy, the quotes there, you'll see some powerful messages. So when you look at Ecclesiastes 1 and verse 9, it talks about what has been will be again. Daniel 3 and 6 help us to understand how things will play out. A law is passed in Daniel 3. The law is disobeyed, a loud cry given. An attempt is made to destroy those who disobey the law and give a loud cry. That's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel 6 is the same. A law is passed, the law is disobeyed, a loud cry is given. Daniel prays aloud that they might hear that he's praying to Jehovah. An attempt is made to destroy him. So if we want to understand verse 44 of Daniel 11, we've got chapters 3 and 6 that will help us to do so. So verse 44 in a nutshell, but the tidings out the east and the north, a loud cry shall trouble him, that is the papacy. Therefore, the papacy will go forth to try and destroy those who give the message. And what we see in verse 45 is the polarization. The message results in two camps, because the papacy plants the tabernacle of his palace between the seas, and it should say in the glorious holy mountain. So you've got the seas, which according to Revelation 17 and verse 15 are peoples, and the glorious holy mountain, which is a reference ultimately to God's people. Ultimately to God's people. You can see there that the word shouldn't be in, but and he, that is the king of the north, or the papacy, should tabernacle, his war tent, you could translate that, and between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. So you got a polarization that's a result of the religious message coupled with the Revelation 18 message. And you can see the seas references people, and you can see those verses there, Isaiah 2 and 3, Daniel 9 and verse 6, a mountain can represent God's people. And some quotes there, Sister White, verse 45, and he, the king of the north, or Satan and his forces, papacy, shall plant the tabernacle of his palace between, or he will divide the seas, the people of the world. And so there'll be a divide and a polarization between the people of the world and God's people that will be the result of the preaching of the messages that we've seen. And you've got the two classes referred to in Revelation 13. I'm almost finished. 13 verse 8. You've got a people whose names are not written in the book. Those people will wander after the beast. As Eve wandered after the serpent, they'll wander after the beast. But then you've got in Daniel 12 verse 1, a reference to people whose names are written in the book. So you've got two classes. You're either written in the book or you're not. You've either wandered after the beast or you've not. You're either in the glorious holy mountain or you're a part of the sea. So verse 45, and the king or the papacy, led by Satan, shall plant the tabernacle of his palaces. He'll cause a divide between the people of the world and God's people. Yet he, the king of the north, shall come to his end. God is going to destroy, because Michael is going to stand up. Michael is going to stand up, and you see references to what happens in these particular verses that we find in the prophetic line of chapter 2, prophetic line of chapters 7 and 8. And then we've got a reference to the close of probation, Michael standing up. Now, very quickly, as we close, working backwards from the close of probation depicted in Daniel 12, verse 1. Daniel 12, verse 1 is the close of probation. Let me go through one at a time. I'm almost finished. Daniel 11 and verse 45 talks about a polarization that precedes the close of probation. How and why? Because of the tidings out of the east and the north, Revelation 14 plus Revelation 18, that's preceded by financial control that can put pressure on people who want to preach the tidings. And then we see the papacy has to subdue the world financially and economically and militarily before all of that. And basically, in reverse, you've got the close of probation that preceded by a polarization, that's preceded by tidings out of the east and the north that polarize the people, that's preceded by financial control, the subjugation of the world, first of all, the subjugation of the USA, and it all happens sometime after the time of the end. And we can expand on verses 40, 42, and 43, looking at Revelation 13 and 17. And that's the end of the presentation. I'm hoping that you were all blessed and that I've not spoken too fast and I can't see. Let me just get out of this and stop sharing. How do I actually stop sharing my screen? How do I put it on full screen? Again, Craig, I don't even know. Oh, that's it. Okay. Yeah, so that's me having spoken really quickly, having, by the grace of God, fitted in, something that I would normally do in maybe, well, quite a lot longer, but I'm hoping that you've been blessed. And Craig, thanks so very much for the privilege of presenting. And I'm just gonna say, read the notes, and you'll be able to take your time to go through the stuff that I've spoken very, using very quick words. So